Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Vincent, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Economics, and I'm also the co-director of the Center for Property Tax Reform, who is hosting this event today. Thanks very much for coming, and we think you'll find it edifying and interesting and crucial in this COVID-19 era. We're going to discuss land value taxation. We're going to hear from people in the Philadelphia city government, experts from outside city government, and some of my very talented colleagues at the Center for Property Tax Reform. So without further ado, let's kick this off. And it's good to see new friends and some old friends.
Hello, everybody. My name is John Geeting. I am here today in my role as a co-founder of Fifth Square, which is an urbanist advocacy group here in Philadelphia that is interested in transportation, land use, public space, kind of the whole gamut of built environment and city planning kinds of policies. And land value tax is something that I've been interested in for a long time as a writer and an activist. And I've always seen it as kind of the tax side complement to some of the land use and like zoning changes that urbanists are interested in here as a way to try and encourage a more kind of compact and walkable built environment where people can live close to jobs and opportunities. And so I'm excited to see that this conversation is happening. I think that it's great to see that some city council members are interested in talking about this as we head into a tough budget season where our normal tax options are kind of limited by the unique situation around work from home and some of the other things that are happening. So yeah, looking forward to hearing this conversation, and thanks everybody for joining today to talk about this. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Josie Foss. I am the co-director of the Center for Property Tax Reform and the executive director of the Robert Schockenbach Foundation. I want to thank you for joining us today for this event, Rebuild, Re-envision, and Reform, How a Land Value Tax Would Impact Philadelphia. At this event, we're going to talk about a sort of unsexy topic, which is property taxes. And you may initially have wondered why not, another tax that's kind of flashier, like a wealth tax. Well, taxes like that, like wealth taxes, have a way of slipping through our fingers. And in fact, if you look at the city of Philadelphia in the COVID environment, what you see is that happening all over the place. So tax bases, by and large for the city, have declined significantly, especially anything that's dependent on tourism or travel. Those things are just not happening anymore. If you look at the property tax, however, that's sort of the exception to that trend. The property tax has held strong for the city throughout the COVID economy and is expected to do so continually. And the reason is simple, is that real property has real value, and it just doesn't diminish in that sort of responsive way that other tax bases do. So clearly property tax may not be exciting, but it's important. And that's why we're talking about it today. And specifically, we're talking about a version of property taxes called land value tax, or a close sibling of land value tax, a two-rate tax. And so what are those things? Well, really, it's very simple. A pure land value tax taxes the value of land and does not tax the value of improvements like homes, businesses, and other buildings. A two-rate tax has some portion of the bill that derives from the value of improvements, but the majority comes from the assessment of the value of land. So how that's different from property taxes in Philadelphia today is pretty significant. So right now, if you look at that property tax stream, what you'll see is that about 75% of those dollars are generated through a tax on the assessed value of improvements, whereas only about 25% comes from the assessed value of land. And why that matters is pretty simple. Taxing that way has a whole handful of effects. I'm going to focus on just a couple right now. We'll get into more depth later in the program, but basically focusing on improvements is a more regressive way of structuring a property tax than focusing on land. And by that, what I mean is, for Philadelphia in particular, lower income residents and smaller businesses have higher tax bills than they do under a more land-focused system. And that's keeping the amount of revenue constant. So that's not diminishing overall revenue for the city. That's just in general. When you structure it that way, you're going to get more regressive results than if you focus on land. And the other thing, and this is something that's not peculiar to Philadelphia, but it's just a function of a traditional property tax, is that you're creating this perverse incentive for people to hold their land vacant or blighted. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If you're going to focus the tax bill on the value of improvements, you're signaling that people shouldn't make improvements, right? Because effectively, that's a penalty for doing that. That's not what you want as a city, as a town, as anywhere. What you want is improvements. You want people building houses, building businesses, adding on to what they already have. And so when your tax code is effectively punishing these behaviors, what you see is that you're incentivizing people to hold their land vacant or to not make those improvements. And certainly that's not what we want to see. And so by focusing the tax bill on the value of land, you're changing that incentive. You're saying, you know what? The land is what it is. You make your improvements and you're not going to see your tax bill go up. And so you're really telling people, go ahead and make those improvements. And we think that that's really important for Philadelphia and frankly, everywhere. So at this event, we're really focused on this one basic concept of what is a land value tax? What would it mean for Philadelphia? And so the program includes a brief overview of land value taxes and two-rate taxes in Pennsylvania. They've been adopted in about 16 cities, towns, and municipalities so far, and the effects have been highly positive in terms of economic growth and also supporting citizens and sort of not going into tax arrears because of this new tax system. We'll also have an in-depth look at the analytical work that the center has done around implementing a land value tax in Philadelphia. And so we've created a tool called the Tax Shift Explorer. And what it allows you to do is really look at these specific on-the-ground effects using current tax data at the city level, the city council district level, and then all the way down to the individual parcel. So it really puts the power in the hands of anybody who wants to use the tool and creates complete transparency about what this tax policy would actually look like on the ground. The chat is going to be open throughout the event. So if you have questions along the way, please just type them in. We'll have a Q&A at the end. And before we get into all of that, we're going to hear from a few of the people who know the city best, care the most about its residents and businesses, and those are our city council people. Our first presenter is Councilwoman Maria Quinones Sanchez. She represents the city's 7th district.
Hello, I want to thank the Center for Property Tax Reform for inviting me to this important conversation. Rebuild, re-envision, reform. How a land value tax would impact the city of Philadelphia. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. My name is Maria Quinones Sanchez. I'm the councilwoman in the 7th District in the city of Philadelphia. I'm chair of the Committee on Appropriations and Education. The City Council of Philadelphia has explored land value taxation in many public hearings. There are different opinions about how the uniformity clause has hurt our ability to tax fairer. Historically, people have looked at capital improvements, infrastructure improvements as a pathway to tax increases. This, I believe, disincentivizes people to make improvements on their house or improve the quality of their neighborhoods. Why a land value tax and why now? Blunt instruments like tax abatement create a system that is unfair for longtime residents in neighborhoods. I believe a fair land value tax will provide us with a smoothing ability to improve our neighborhoods without passing the unrealized value of improvements and abatements on to long-term residents or residents who do not have the ability to make new improvements in their properties. I think this is the appropriate time to have this conversation. What we've learned in the tax abatement discussion, as well as in the assessment process, is that Philadelphians do not trust our tax assessment process and therefore have no faith in their tax bills and believe that we are unfair. The numbers bear out. Our tax assessment system and the current system in place makes that poor people in low-income neighborhoods proportionately pay more on their property than those newer, abated neighborhoods throughout the city of Philadelphia. I want to thank the center for having this conversation because in a post-COVID world, as we talk about social justice and fairness, and we protect long-term residents, many who are homeowners, as we try to improve homeownership opportunities and mixed income diverse neighborhoods in all the city, we will have to use land value and fairness as a mechanism to get there. Why now? I believe we're at a moment in time when we look to create mixed income diverse neighborhoods throughout the entire city. We are going to have to be more focused, more intentional, and ensure that there is fairness throughout the city of Philadelphia. When we assess property, using a land value tax allows us to be more predictable for ourselves, for income purposes for the city of Philadelphia, and more predictable for our residents. In an old city like the city of Philadelphia, we should be encouraging all preservation and all improvements into our housing stock. Penalizing residents for improvements or luxury additions into their homes does not help us incentivize those types of preservation improvements in the city of Philadelphia. So Councilwoman Maria Quinones Sanchez believes it is time to have this conversation. It is time for us to figure out what the percentage of land and how we want to value it, and what the percentage for our structures and how we want to value it. As we look for affordable housing tools, whether they're density, parking allowances, transport-oriented development, infrastructure improvements in our green space and our open spaces, we should ensure fairness. Land value, I believe, takes us to a safer, fair space for the city of Philadelphia. In order for us to build trust in our citizens and our residents around a land value discussion, first, we have to fix our assessment process. The CAMA system that has been delayed in its implementation, different tax ranges throughout the city, has caused for distrust among the citizens. We need a professional, best practices assessment process so that residents can trust that we are actually capturing value and not disincentivizing improvements, at the same time as making sure that new residents who utilize abatements to purchase and move into the city of Philadelphia do not have an unfair advantage among long-term residents. I believe Philadelphia should provide for a robust discussion on land value tax. I believe the City Council of Philadelphia in a post-COVID world should encourage this, and I believe that a land value tax system that with a good assessment process is going to build trust, predictability for those in the development community as well as those on fixed income in the city of Philadelphia. The goal is diverse mixed income neighborhoods. I believe we can get there.
Thank you, Maria. And now we're going to hear from Councilman Wilson Good Jr.
In January, I retired from local government after serving 21 years in Philadelphia City Council, 16 years as an at-large member, and 5 years as senior policy advisor. You know, we went through multiple economic cycles over that time period. We attempted to enact several remedies to Philadelphia's long-term economic problems. The biggest question is, what were we really trying to achieve? Recover from recessions, become more competitive, simply respond to special interest groups? The answer is all the above, particularly when it comes to tax policy. We've had tax reform commissions, we've debated real estate values, property tax abatements, we've examined the business tax structure, we've even looked at taxing mega nonprofits. Sometimes not in search of a solution, but in search of a problem, to find a hot new political issue. One issue has always been staring us in the face: the land in Philadelphia, how much is it worth? Its value can determine public school funding, local government's borrowing capacity, our tax structure, our collective economic success. Some residents and business owners believe that our economic success is linked to the lowering of their tax burden. It's a bit more complicated than that. Government must tax something to raise the revenue to provide necessary services. So what should be taxed? Most of us already know. We should shift the tax burden from things that are mobile, like wages and businesses, to assets that are fixed, like land and property. Mobile taxes have cost us new businesses, new jobs, and new residents. Incrementally decreasing those taxes can only bring us incremental growth. Consequently, the city must shift its tax revenue strategy to really grow our economic base by reducing our reliance on wage and business taxes and shifting the burden to real estate taxes, shifting that burden specifically to commercial and industrial land. The only land value tax proposal to make it to Philadelphia City Council was the 2003 Tax Reform Commission proposal to phase it in. So at the end of 10 years, 50% of all real estate value revenue would be generated from a tax on the value of land and 50% from a tax on the value of structures. I supported it, but it failed miserably because the issue was completely overshadowed by a big push for complete business tax elimination over 10 years. Clearly, the big business brigade wanted working class homeowners to take on more of the tax burden. My preference was only to eliminate a portion of business tax as we looked at making a shift away from mobile taxes. It was never really an opportunity to fully discuss land value taxation at that time, or even during the actual value initiative debate. It's clear this issue needs to be discussed now. Thank you for allowing me to make some remarks. I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Wilson. And now we're going to hear from Councilman Derek Green.
My name is Councilmember at Large Derek Green. I serve in the city of Philadelphia. First learned about the land value tax when I was there for former council member Marion Tasco. It was an idea I thought that had a lot of interest and was very intriguing to me at that time. We were at that time looking at how we reform taxes here in the city of Philadelphia. There was a tax reform commission initiative, and the land value tax was one of those ideas. But now as we move forward into 2021, this idea of land value tax has taken an even greater promise and opportunity. Cities like Philadelphia have been very impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. A core portion of our revenue come from those who work in our city but live outside of our city. So this non-resident wage tax is a significant portion of our revenue. And because of the pandemic, many people who are attorneys like myself, or architects, engineers, or others who work in our center city core have now been working from home. And as a result, the city of Philadelphia has not been able to collect those wage taxes from those non-residents. And so that's put a very significant impact on our budget. Last year, we had a $750 million deficit, and we had to fill that deficit before we started the new year on July 1. So during that time, we were having the Tax Reform Commission conversation. One of the things that has been discussed is how do we shift from having more of our taxes based on areas like real estate and less on areas like wage tax or business income receipt tax. Many of our peer cities like Boston and others have a much stronger portion of their taxes based on real estate. The challenge has always been, how do we reduce our wage and business income receipt taxes in a way that does not have a negative impact on the revenues that come into our city that we use for so many quality of life issues and concerns that our residents have. So now in this current situation, as we're trying to navigate through the economic challenges that the pandemic has provided, I think the land value tax has now created another opportunity to start that shift as a way of putting more of a tax focus on real estate and reduce that tax focus on our wage taxes or business income receipts taxes. And we can possibly do that in a way that is revenue neutral. Not that long ago, our city recently increased the assessment on land for those that have the 10-year tax abatement. And so in some ways, the city is already starting this exploration in this idea of a land value tax. And I think it provides some additional opportunities going forward so we can start to shift the taxes that are assessed on wages for both residents and non-residents, on businesses, and more onto fixed assets like real estate. And I think the land value tax could be an option, an opportunity to do that, that can make us more competitive in trying to grow businesses in our city. One of the challenges we as a city have is that we are the biggest city in the nation with the highest level of poverty at close to 26%. So ways that we could find ways to reduce our taxes from a business perspective, but not impacting in a negative way those quality of life resources and things that we want to do is something we need to address. And I believe the land value tax is an option that we need to explore so we can make that shift going forward and provide some better opportunities in our city.
All right, now we're going to take a moment to just kind of catch up on the history of land value tax in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia specifically. Pennsylvania is no stranger to land value taxes and two-rate tax systems. Studies of the 16 cities, towns, and school districts where they exist show increased levels of home ownership, decreased residential tax foreclosure rates, growth in residential market values, increased numbers of new businesses, and increased commercial property values. Philadelphia has long considered adopting a land value tax of its own. Recent efforts to bring land value tax to the city of brotherly love commenced in 1982, when councilpeople Tayyoun and Spector co-sponsored a bill that would reduce the rate on improvements and raise the rate on land. Despite widespread support in council and the administration, the bill was ultimately derailed by calls for additional studies of its likely effects. In 1989, facing a $174 million budget gap, the Tayyoun-Spector bill was revived by the Good administration. It found support in the Philadelphia Board of Realtors, but encountered major opposition from the Parkway Corporation and the Chevron oil refinery, who argued that their land-intensive businesses would be unfairly burdened. Ultimately, council found alternative means to span the budget gap. Fast forward to 2001, and we see land value tax again appear on the city's radar, this time as part of Comptroller Seidel's tax structure analysis report. Councilwoman Reynolds Brown introduced two bills focused on land value tax, which were co-sponsored by Councilman Clark and Kenny, but lacking strong support from the street administration and council as a whole, they failed to pass. Less than a year later, another resolution authorized a hearing on land value taxation. The standing room only event took place on April 29, 2003, but despite positive testimony from Comptroller Seidel and many other experts, officials, and Philadelphia citizens, no further action was taken. Later that year, land value taxation was again adopted as a formal recommendation of the Philadelphia Tax Reform Commission, but the resulting bill failed to pass. The idea of land value tax in Philadelphia lay largely dormant for more than a decade. Then in early 2015, Councilman at Large Green considered it as a means to pay for education improvement districts that would increase the funding available to schools at no extra cost to the Philadelphia School District. Although analyses showed the viability of the policy, it did not gain traction. The following year saw the swearing in of Mayor Kenny, whose numerous new initiatives carried a hefty $95 million annual price tag. A land value tax was once again considered, but ultimately lawmakers passed the city's highly regressive soda tax in the hopes of covering the costs. In 2019, as the push to cap I-95 and build parks on the newly created real estate gained traction, considerations of value capture, namely ensuring that the owners of vacant land surrounding the project did not reap the rewards of the taxpayers' investments, again claimed headlines and city officials' attention. One need look no further than New York City's Central Park, or more recently Boston's Big Dig, to find examples of speculators making millions in the wake of similar projects. And yet, the policy that would easily prevent such an outcome was again passed over. Implementation of a land value tax has been considered in Philadelphia numerous times, and each time this policy, which benefits residents and small businesses and makes land speculators and owners of blighted properties pay their fair share, has failed to take hold. Will 2021 be any different? Will the massive budget shortfalls of the pandemic economy be enough to galvanize support for this long-considered approach to taxation?
You've heard a lot of great speakers from really different walks of Philadelphia city life. And what we're learning is that we need several things right now in Philadelphia. We need a fair tax system. We need one that provides growth and one that does not retard growth. Let me give you an example of what can happen. We have a sales tax in the city of Philadelphia. It's very regressive. It attacks the poor, essentially. And unfortunately, low-income, poor, and struggling areas and neighborhoods tend to take the brunt of tax policy. For years, we've been trying to fix this in Philadelphia with the Tax Reform Commission, Comptroller Seidel. We could go on. The support from academics, city officials, professionals, and citizens has always been very positive. The results have been very positive. So we're looking again at the new data that you'll be seeing in just a second. And we just have to think about, in the time of a pandemic, what is the most important thing to do? One is pay the bills. Now, from FY21 up till now, the parking tax, the soda tax, the other taxes that we have, wage taxes, have slipped. The BERT has managed to hold on somewhat due to the abatements and exemptions that were granted by the city throughout the year. The property tax has seen some slippage, but a lot of that is really on paper. Property tax bills are based on quarterly payments in many cases. So what we're left with is the idea of going back and taxing something that is not mobile, and that's land values and the buildings on top. We think that the tax on land values has been demonstrated over a couple of centuries by some very good economists to be a terrific idea. Many economists in Philadelphia agree with it, such as the members of Penn, Drexel, and Temple. Now, if we think about mobile taxation for one more minute, when you listen to KYW, I don't know if anybody does, 1060 on your radio dial, they have a lot of commercials every day. And I'd wager a good amount of them always say, shop in tax-free Delaware. And that's the problem. And people not only are shopping in tax-free Delaware, they're voting with their feet, and they're trying to avoid the wage taxes and other really harmful business taxes. But at the same time, we have some inequities in the system of assessment and property tax itself. Now, we know that abatement works. We granted a 10-year tax abatement, and voila, we got lots of nice, tall condos. But the problem with subsidizing construction to that amount has a really deleterious effect, as most of you know, in the neighborhoods. And the people in the neighborhoods whose values have increased are wondering, well, why? We're having these Taj Mahals come into our neighborhood, and it's artificially inflating my property values. So we think that with the land value tax, we could be able to come up with a brought in solution gradually, as we've always suggested, and start to throttle back on the direct taxes in Philadelphia that make Philadelphia one of the highest tax states in the nation and one of the most regressive taxing cities in the nation. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to a really smart guy, and his name is Kevin Frick. He's our geospatial analyst at the Center for Property Tax Reform. He's Temple, so there you go. And I'm going to let him show you the Tax Shift Explorer that I hope you'll all take advantage of. So Kevin?
Thanks, Josh. Let me share my screen now. Cool. So, hello everyone. My name is Kevin Frick. I'm a geospatial developer and analyst for the Center for Property Tax Reform. And this is the Tax Shift Explorer. It's a mapping tool that was built to simulate a split rate tax system, which means that land and improvements are taxed at two different rates, depending on the percent of total revenue share you want to be generated from land. The actual percent revenue share from land can be seen at the top here. Most cities see between 15 and 30% of their revenue generated from tax on land. In Philadelphia, that number is 25%. As Wilson Good Jr. mentioned earlier, one of the most common models is a 50-50 split, meaning that 50% of total revenue comes from taxing land value and 50% of total revenue comes from taxing improvements. This is what is shown when the map initially loads. Another common model is for 100% of the city's property tax revenue to be generated from taxing land, leaving buildings completely tax-free. This tool can simulate both and everything in between using the slider at the bottom. As Councilman Green alluded to earlier, this tool is called the Tax Shift Explorer because it's based on a revenue neutral model, meaning that the tax burdens shift geographically and across land use types In other words, this map shows that this is not an additional tax, but rather a more equitable replacement for the current system. With the residential land use type selected, we can see that residents across the entire city would benefit from a split rate tax indicated by the blue shading. Specifically in districts 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9, which would all see at least a 20% reduction in median tax bill. By clicking on the district itself, we can see the actual change in median tax bill, as well as population and demographic information. If we switch land use type to commercial properties, we can see that businesses of all sizes and locations would benefit from this model. The effects are most pronounced in districts 1, 2, and 5. Same patterns can be seen with the mixed use land category. This includes small mom and pop stores, corner stores, but also some larger apartment buildings with commercial retail on the bottom floor. So you might be wondering if residential and commercial properties that make up a large share of the city's overall budget would all see decrease. You might wonder where the difference is made up. Well, the first land use category is vacant lands. Since vacant parcels have no improvements to pay taxes on, their tax bills would essentially quadruple or double or quadruple, depending on the model. Taxing vacant land parcels higher makes up for so much of the difference that it allows most residential and commercial properties to see a tax break. Taxing vacant land also disincentivizes land use speculation and encourages development of affordable housing, since when the land eventually does become improved, there will be no taxes on those improvements. The second type to help make up the difference is non-tax buildings. This category consists of parcels that have fully exempt buildings, but still pay taxes on the land. Many of these parcels are part of the abatement program and homestead exemption, but this also includes surface level parking lots. Now that we've seen how tax burdens shift geographically, I want to show some charts to show the progressivity of this kind of tax system and how the tax burdens also shift, across classes. So here, each land use type is broken out into quantile buckets based on the property's market value. And the bars show how the median tax bills in each group would change from the current median tax. So for single family homes, the lower 60% would all see significant decreases, while the top 40% would only see a slight increase. Progressivity is also very clear in multifamily, with all the way up to 80% seeing a decrease. And it's also very clear in commercial, with small and medium-sized businesses really seeing a lot of benefit, while the top 20% would only see a slight increase. Mixed use across the board would see a decrease. Progressivity is clear in industrial, and of course, vacant lands, the taxes would increase quite significantly for this. Another way to visualize this is total tax liabilities for the city. This graph shows the current tax liabilities in blue, tax liabilities if 50% of revenue came from land in red and 100% revenue came from land in yellow. Although in any scenario, you could see, the vast majority of revenue comes from residential properties. Although as we see, as the percent of revenue generated from land increases, overall taxes on residential, commercial, and mixed use decrease, while taxes on vacant lands and non-tax buildings increase. If you'd like to explore this data further for yourself, please visit taxshiftexplorer.org. You can see Philadelphia along with a dozen other cities, so you can play around with that. Thank you for attending. I will now turn it over to our outreach coordinator, Stephanie, for our Q&A session. Thank you.
Hi all, I'm Stephanie. I'm here to address all your questions in the chat, so please be patient with us. We're going to try to get to all of them. So we're going to start with the first question. How can you assure that long-term residents in developing areas won't also get hit by much higher taxes, along with the owners of vacant lots? Team?
If I could grab that, we already have the homestead exemption in place, which is pretty robust, and we would still keep that in place. In fact, our numbers take that into account. Uh, I would suggest an improvement that would not need much of a change. In towns that have land value tax in the rest of Pennsylvania, the homestead exemption applies only to the land. So we could quite possibly end up with lower valued properties, homestead properties, not paying any tax or very little tax. And about the vacant lots, well, I want them to pay a lot more, and because they need to stop blighting neighborhoods and they need to be development opportunities where it's appropriate.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in to add, the way that we've done this analysis is revenue neutral. So it's the same amount of money coming into the city annually. And that means that as vacant parcels start to pay their fair share, other people see their tax bills going down. And so if you think back to those charts that Kevin had put up, you really do see that it becomes a very progressive tax structure with lower income residents or residents who own lower value properties paying significantly less under this policy.
Great. Next question is, land value tax seems to be a great solution, but what has been the biggest issue for land value tax seen in other cities?
Well, I've been knocking my head against the wall for 25 years, so I think I have the right to start off. Assessments. And as Councilwoman Maria Quinones Sanchez said, assessments are a big issue. They've gotten so much better in the past 10 years in Philadelphia, but they're still catching up. And assessments do not have to be a political issue, but they often are. If there's a bad assessment in a city, oftentimes a land value tax is absolutely inappropriate. For example, in Chester County, when Coatesville had an LVT and a very successful LVT, there was a reassessment, a reevaluation, and the city asked us to take a look at it. And we looked at the numbers and we had to advise Coatesville to get rid of the land value tax until the assessments changed. I would say that's the biggest obvious problem. The rest, of course, is opposition from people who get more attention than other people do. And again, that's a political question. So I'll leave it up to the politicians.
Yeah, if you remember back to that short history video, the opposition from the Parkway Corporation and from Chevron, large landholders tend to sometimes have political sway, and under a tax scheme where land is taxed more intensely, they end up paying more. And so they make noise, and that can certainly be a barrier.
Yeah, it's funny though. I can say that after years of the 10-year tax abatement, that Parkway Corporation is a responsible owner and operator of big giant buildings all across Philadelphia. So they might want to rethink that. And we know that the Chevron site is going to be turned into a green LEED certified development, and a land value tax can only help them achieve their goals.
The next question is, does the implementation of a land value tax require a reforming of how assessments are done? Is this also the case in Pennsylvania? If so, how do we ensure that the full value of land is assessed?
Shall I take that? I can answer the question about assessments. Most of the cities, post-industrial cities in Western Pennsylvania that implemented LVT did so based on the vaguest of assessments. I can remember that McKeesport and Altoona, they hadn't been reassessed since the 1950s. And so like their property tax administrators, we had to project a land value tax under a terrible assessment. However, I think that greater attention to assessments is being demonstrated. I think that the idea of splitting land values and building values correctly is a matter of routine these days with CAMA or computer-assisted mass appraisal. So I think all in all, assessments will be an issue, but it's not a deal breaker at all. And it's also a better incentive to make the assessments as good as they can be.
Yeah, and a traditional property tax is based on assessments as well. So, we all pay property tax based on whatever quality assessments we happen to have. And certainly any tax that's applied to land and improvements is going to be more representative based on better assessments.
Next question is, as we talk about shifting to a land value tax, how do we put the framework in place to accurately value this tax, that is, value it directly?
Josie, you want
To accurately value, I'm sorry, I missed a key word, I think.
I think I read it really fast. So as we talk about shifting to a land value tax, how do we put the framework in place to accurately value this land? That is, value it directly, question mark.
Yeah, so I guess, again, coming to sort of the quality of the assessments, right? And so there's professional methodologies for assessing, to then levy property taxes. I think there's been historically a focus on improvements. And I know there's sort of a discourse around, how easy it is to assess land, but I think that it's certainly possible. There's professional best practices. And if they're not being applied in particular places, then that's something that can be remedied. It's knowable how much land is worth. You just have to bake that into your assessments. And then, it's just a matter of applying these tax values.
And luckily in Philadelphia, the data is pretty good and recent. It's year over year, and it's broken out by market value, but also market building value, and market land value. And then there's also data for the exemptions amounts. So, in those charts I was showing before, showing the progressivity, abated properties would actually be, or many of them would actually be in the highest, or some of the higher percentiles, because it's based on market value. But in reality, they pay much less right now because that actual tax value is much, much lower.
I'd like to riff on that if I could for a second. From what I've seen of the progressive study, in other words, is this a progressive tax? Is it an ability to pay tax? The answer is yes, but what's interesting is that our current tax system seems to tax the lowest third, 2/3 of value, than the highest third of value. And so we can change that right now. But I think going into it, the process, we do, as Councilman Good and Green have suggested, which is to go into this slowly. It took us decades to get into this mess. It's going to take us a few years at least to get out. So we steadily reduce the tax on buildings, steadily increase the tax on land values. If people want to stop and take a breath over a year, they may, because this is just your annual property tax ordinance.
Great. Our next question is Philadelphia able to establish a split rate tax rate without state authorizing legislation as a home rule county?
As a home rule jurisdiction, yes. And we got that several years ago from the city solicitor during the controller's study in 2004.
Next question is, how would you phase in LVT so that it does not bring a sudden shift in tax burden, causing economic dislocation and hardship?
Yeah, so I mean, essentially what we would recommend is doing it in phases. So what Kevin was presenting in terms of those numbers was essentially that 50% of the tax revenues would come from tax on land and 50% from on buildings. But I think typically, and Josh has been involved in this, on the ground for many years, he recommends, and we would also recommend, that you do it in sort of 10 percentage point increments so that it is phased in gradually rather than sort of flipping a switch on people relatively quickly. And giving everyone a beat to adjust as things shift.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Next question is, what is the current number of vacant lots and abandoned housing units in Philadelphia? How many years might be required to bring these properties back into productive use?
That's a really good question. How long would it take to get these vacant lots back into use? We use the experience of urban sprawl. Sometimes it takes less than 2 years for a development to be built out. as long as we make Philadelphia competitive in the tax sense with any outside area, New Jersey, even Delaware or the counties, then you're going to get capital flowing to where it's most comfortable. So I think that that the issue of phasing it in slowly and the issue of taking care, which is what we should be doing as a city anyway, taking care not to affect distressed neighborhoods, that should be paramount.
And yeah, to answer the first part of that question, there's over 30,000 vacant lots across the city. So quite a lot.
Next question is a multi-part question. What technical way of separating a land value from the full property value, land and building combined, did you apply to the assessment and the tax shift explorer? So how did you function land value? Is your land value assessment equation dynamic, dependent on locational centrality from the downtown of a city? And how do you really separate the land value of a lot from the full property value of the lot combined with the building?
So yeah, so this is all based on data from the Office of Property Assessment. So, we are relying on the assessment data to be valid in a sense. And like I mentioned earlier, it is broken out into not only the market values at the most recent sale price, but the market values of improvements and land, and also the actual final tax values for improvements in land, which is, and then there's the exemption amount for both. So, our current models really rely on the data being correct, and that's what we're basing it on. We have sort of talked about maybe some future projects where we do more of a pour out land evaluation that would be sort of an assessment recommendation, in a way, but that's a little far down the road.
Yeah, and
So basically, sorry, go ahead, Josh.
No, please.
I was just gonna say the city already breaks out those values. So in the Tax Shift Explorer, we're just using the city's data. And what Kevin was alluding to as a future project that we're actually going to be starting soon, which will be a mapping project where we are kind of seeking out potentially poor assessments. And so that will be something cool coming down the pike that Kevin will be spearheading for us. And hopefully we'll do another event about that at some point.
Yeah, and I should say that the State Department of Equalization actually ranks Philadelphia pretty high in accurate assessments, not inaccurate, accurate assessments. So compared to some counties, their coefficient of dispersion, and I'm not going to go any further into that, is horrendous. But Philadelphia is pretty good as far as that goes. We do have to adjust some things, and going into a new system, like every other system, there would be some time for adjustment.
Next question is there a tipping point in terms of median home value in terms of benefit based on your LVT model?
I didn't quite hear that.
Is there a tipping point in terms of median home value in terms of benefit based on your LVT model?
Oh, yeah, that's Kevin, you provided that information, right?
Yeah. Yeah, let me just look at this real quick. Is there a tipping point in terms of median home value based on in terms of, yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, especially, I'll talk about single family homes first. So single family homes, the bottom 60% of all properties, which is anywhere from $1,000 to $163,000 in market value. So that's the point when after that, from 163,000 to all the way up to the highest is, or about, well, I guess we'll go by medians. The highest would be 330,000 for the upper median. So yeah, around 160 to 200,000. That's sort of the tipping point where it turns. But if you, that's not a 50-50 model. If you bump it up to 100%, it actually is more like 300,000.
Okay. The Tax Shift Explorer will have all of that information if people would like to go and investigate, and I think they should.
Yeah, and I'll just say one other quick feature that I didn't really show on the Tax Shift Explorer is you can actually, you can either use the search bar in the upper top right, or you can just zoom in all the way to look at individual parcels. And based on the current data, how each scenario would affect every specific parcel throughout the entire city.
Yeah, and just to further answer the question, so Kevin, you talked about single family, multifamily, actually up until, the sort of 80% and below see their tax bills go down under this 50% model. So really only sort of the highest end residential properties are going to see their tax bills go up, and it's by a relatively small amount,
Right.
even though there is a slight increase there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we should keep in mind that Philadelphia, like it or not, is pretty much a city of renters. It used to be a city of homeowners, owner-occupiers, and it's tragic that changed. But so many people are living in high rises or medium rises. They're in the mixed use category, and they're going to do very well indeed.
Yeah, currently it's about 46% of properties are owner occupied and 41% are renters.
Yes, and mixed use does see overall tax bills going down in every one of those quintiles of the distribution.
Mm-hmm.
So the 100% LBT model benefits homes valued over 300K, question mark?
No, not necessarily. There are a lot of homes valued under 300K, and they're going to percentage-wise save the most. At least that's what I've learned from Kevin's research. And that's how it's been in the past when we've studied this in Philadelphia, either the council staff or Controller Seidel. Lower valued homes, if they're assessed halfway decently, do very well. And where you're seeing probably some increases is properties that are of middle to high value rather than low to lower middle value. And that's been the outcome year after year.
Yeah, and that's probably even intensified a little bit by the abatement program and the fact that this policy sort of semi-negates a bit of that. You do tend to see the higher valued properties benefiting currently from those abatements. And as soon as you start shifting more of the tax burden onto land, the abatement matters less. And so you do see an increase as a result of that as well.
Do you all have foreign resident owned land? Or I think maybe they mean, do you include all foreign resident owned land?
Yeah, we include all land that's in the city. We're actually working on another project right now that's looking at absentee landlords. We're actually looking at Cuyahoga County, Cleveland first, but it'll probably apply to Philadelphia as well. Looking at records that indicate that mailing address is out of state and things like that to try and figure out who owns the land and where are they. Is the city really owned by the people within the city? So we haven't done that quite for Philadelphia just yet, but something we're looking at.
Yeah, that should be next, right? Who owns Philadelphia? Folks, do you know?
Next question is, what will you do to push for fair assessments and remedy poor assessments?
Kevin, you want to grab that again, or it's a philosophical question in a sense, because we're not in charge of the assessments, but we can certainly play a role, as Kevin is planning to do, to look for disconnects between assessed value and real world value. And if you can identify, and I think it's fairly routine, if you can identify those differences, and especially in Kevin's further research, we'd be able to bring it to the attention of OPA.
Yeah. Another project I'm currently working on is basically looking at outliers in a geographic area that that the assessment is an outlier, in some way that compared to all its neighbors. And yeah, certainly finding a lot. So I think that would be one way to push for fair assessments, is to find the outliers first and kind of smooth them out, figure out why they are assessed so much higher than their neighbors or lower in some cases, and adjust accordingly, sort of using standard deviation models and sort of buffering other parcels within the distance of a single parcel.
Question is, how many homeless do you have in relation to the vacant properties? Are you calculating poverty into this equation?
I think on Kevin's council descriptions and also on the sheets, I think we have, economic status, I think. But
Yeah, if you click on any of the council districts, you can see median household income. We don't currently have any data on homelessness in the city.
Now, I'd like to say that the homeless situation is pretty bad. It's not as bad as California, of course, but the housing first model is something that I think the land value tax could complement. Housing first being a situation where homeless individuals or families are, saved from the streets and given a place of their own. And there's a lot of good programs, of course, in Philadelphia that do just that. But housing first, in the types of properties that they use, they generally see a big tax decrease. So it would mean operating rent would be lower, and of course, there would not be as much deferred maintenance as we have right now in the city. That's why our buildings are falling down. Nobody's putting any money into them.
Stephanie, you're muted.
Sorry about that. We have one last question. Has the Philadelphia Urban Affairs Coalition expressed a position on moving to a two-rate property tax structure?
In 1990, in 2002, with Controller Seidel's report, they did. We spoke with, at that time, Ms. Matlock Turner, and they had no problems with it. Of course, if they want to make land cheaper and unlock the vast supply of vacant land so that regular people can afford a decent home, then I'm sure they would support it, but we'll ask them officially.
So we are bumping up against 2 o'clock. So I think we're gonna cut off the questions. There were some wonderful questions entered in the chat that we didn't get to. So I apologize if you asked one that we didn't address. I'm gonna see if we can pull the chat and perhaps follow up with people in some way. But I think our contact information is on our website. A recording of this event will be posted soon. And I wanna thank everybody for coming. It was really great to share these ideas and get questions and feedback. The center will be hosting more events in the near future. Josh, you have additional words of goodbye for everyone?
I would simply say, if you want to hear about more neighborhood specific things, which I know we've done in the past with LVT, Stephanie will be glad to arrange a webinar or a Zoom meeting for your neighborhood or your civic association. And I would just reach out to Stephanie and she could set that up. I think that this is really a neighborhood issue. We are a city of neighborhoods, and some of them are very different from the other. So I think if we could explore at that level, it would be terrific. We can't keep going on the way things are. I think plugging the holes in the boat with things like the soda tax or the cigarette tax are in the end self-defeating.
All right, with that, thank you all so much for coming. We look forward to seeing you again at another event. Have a wonderful afternoon.